Hey guys, so today we're going to be bringing you guys a video that's a little different from the norm of our normal craziness. But I think the topic is important enough for us to break out of our normality and address it. The topic, of course, being the death of George Floyd or the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think just throughout the week, we've been having conversations with our family and our friends. And we've come together and just found out that a lot of the questions have been overlapping. So we wanted to take this chance to address some of the issues and maybe just have our input in the entire situation.
Right, and even though we feel very strongly about this movement and we stand in support of it, we are by no means experts on the subject. The purpose of this video is just for us to not only voice our views as supporters, as second generation Asian Americans, but also to motivate and inspire you to have these difficult conversations with people around you in your life, your friends, your family, your coworker, your peers, just so that we can keep this movement alive and keep that momentum going and actually, make some real changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so today we also have special guest Eric Sue with us. He's someone we've all grew up with together, and we just thought it would be really great to have him on the video, and we can just all discuss the situation. Before, me, you, and Ray had a conversation where I was really confused as to why, if one guy died in Minnesota, George Floyd, why were there so many protests going on all over the country? Being in LA or New York or whatever, but why were there so many protests that were protesting against police that weren't even related to the situation there in Minnesota? And I think you and Ray really broadened my horizons, let me kind of understand what was, it's a much bigger picture than just this one case.
Yeah, I mean, George Floyd is only the most recent in a long string of police violence, especially against black and brown bodies in America. And a lot of these we only know about because there are videos that people filmed, and like how many more have we not seen or heard about, right? But Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner and Michael Brown and Philando Castile and Breonna Taylor, like the list just goes on and on and on. And every time it feels like there's some outrage, there's some protest, and nothing really changes.
Yeah.
And I think that's just that frustration and that anger, in addition to like a long history of racism, is just kind of come to
a boiling
point recently, where people just they're tired of it, and they just can't wait for change anymore. Like they need to see something happen.
Yeah. So talking about change, I know that, like you said, there's been protests for like many years, but each time we never know if there's going to be a permanent change. We never know if things are actually going to be different. So what's the purpose of the movement?
The protest itself is to bring more awareness, right? Just going out and protesting isn't going to change laws, and it's not going to change how the police treat citizens, but it is going to bring to light a lot of the issues that we've been ignoring for so long. And like you said, it's been happening over and over and over again. And I think that's why this time that intensity is so high, and that it even spread out of our own country, because it's been repeatedly seen that people after that protest, there's no actual change. But the movement itself, it's about promoting equality, right? About shedding light on the injustices, the inequality, the disadvantages that Black Americans have been facing for so long. And so it's not just about police brutality, but it's also a lot about funding and how we treat each other and all of that. So all in all, yes, it's about promoting equality and just making actual practical changes in our system so that this doesn't continue on.
Yeah.
I think on the specific topic of policing and how to improve policing in America in response to these killings, it seems like there's a bit of a ongoing debate right now about what's the best way to do this. In the past there have been calls for reform, adding body cams, adding diversity trainings, and so on, that may or may not have actually led to any real changes, and it's debatable whether or not clearly it wasn't enough to fix the problem entirely. So it seems like there's different schools of thought around whether or not it's possible to incrementally reform and change the police through like individual measures, or ultimately if the system itself is so broken that you need a more radical, like broader type of reform, whether it's defunding or even abolition. So I think that's an ongoing debate that we're seeing, and already the conversation has shifted away from these kind of small incremental reforms towards more ambitious ways of changing policing. But we'll see what happens in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah.
So some examples of how the police system is kind of broken. Number one, police, when they're getting trained and everything, they spend about 8 hours on de-escalation and then 120 plus hours on combat training. And those are just not proper ratios for what we need.
Can you explain what de-escalation is?
De-escalation is like when you're in the heat of something, see if you can talk your way out of actually having to fight
so
or
to
shoot
diffuse
stuff.
the situation.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Number two is qualified immunity. Basically, because of laws and police unions, it becomes really hard for your normal civilian to sue a cop unless they've actually done something. They violated a right that a previous cop has already violated. So, it essentially becomes a cycle where if they haven't already violated a right that has been violated before, then we can't really actually sue them. And number three is the fact that cops and prosecutors work so closely together. Cops are the ones bringing in the evidence for the prosecutors. Prosecutors are the ones pressing charges and everything. So when prosecutors have to charge cops, then it becomes this whole weird, tense, awkward situation, and they kind of just shove everything under the rug. That's why policing is kind of a broken system.
Yeah, I feel like we repeatedly see cops just get a slap on the wrist. They get suspended or they're put on leave or they're in a different department or something. But a lot of the cases that we've talked about and mentioned, there weren't any charges pressed. They weren't arrested. And even with this recent event with George Floyd, Derek Chauvin wasn't even given the proper charges until after all of these protests and all of these petitions and all of that. So, but I mean, through these protests, we've already seen changes, right? In the city of Minneapolis, they're in the process of ending their contract with the police department and, disbanding, and the same in Los Angeles and New York. They're already in the process of defunding the police and instead redirecting those funds to, social workers, to healthcare, to education, in efforts so that, in the future, we don't have to only rely on police to help with these kinds of situations that, are nonviolent in a lot of cases.
And as you mentioned, from these protests, we also saw Breonna Taylor's case getting reopened. We saw the 4 officers, or especially Derek Chauvin, the officer who kneeled on George Floyd's neck. We saw him get fired from being a police officer. We saw him get arrested. We saw his charges getting bumped up from third-degree murder to second-degree murder. So these protests have been helping make changes, at least on the individual level so far.
So undoubtedly, I think we can see that from protests that there have been at least some positive changes throughout the country, but undeniably, we have to also address that because of the protests, there have been situations such as looting or rioting that has happened.
I think when we see so many people grouping together and protesting, unfortunately, you're going to have those opportunists, right, who are just taking advantage of the situation and creating more chaos and benefiting from it for their own selfish reasons. So there are definitely a lot of cases when, it's just violent instigators who aren't actually part of the protest itself that are rioting and looting and all of that. Yeah, which is unfortunate.
Yeah,
but
really unfortunate.
But that does happen when, millions and millions of people are gathering together.
I think it's important to note, as you said, that the vast majority of the protesters are and have been peaceful, and that unfortunately there are extremist groups, white supremacist groups and otherwise, who are using this as an opportunity to further their own agenda. I was reading a case where I think in Las Vegas, the police arrested 3 people who were planning on blowing up something.
Oh
my God.
Yeah, which is pretty scary. So definitely unacceptable. I think it's also worth noting too, frankly, that a lot of the violence that we've seen has come from the side of the police in response to peaceful protesters. So whether it's the case of the 75-year-old man in Buffalo or tons of other cases of police brutality against protesters on camera, with no, no accountability or charges, I think that causes people to lose a lot of faith in the system when nonviolence becomes a standard that they're held to as civilians, as protesters, but violence is something that's condoned when it's being enacted upon them. So, I mean, I think it's important not to condone violence at all, but it's also important to understand some people are being driven to do this in the first place, and not just dismiss the cause because of these cases.
For sure. So, I think a lot of times as Asian Americans, our parents, they would kind of compare themselves to the African American situation, because essentially they both started on zero. You know, our parents are immigrants, and they came to the United States without speaking a word of English, but then they slowly started to build a foundation for themselves that allows them to provide for their families. And not to discredit our parents or anything, because they really did work their asses off to get to the situation that we're in right now. But they also, I think, have a kind of a misguided conception of how African Americans are in general because of media and stuff like that. I think a lot of times their question is, why should we care about Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, I think definitely after speaking to my mom about this whole thing, I got a similar sentiment that she definitely recognizes that there is racism towards African Americans, but what she doesn't really see is that the racism towards African Americans is different from the racism towards Asian Americans. They assume that we're all starting at an even playing field, right? That because they came to America with little resources, no connections, all of that, and they were able to get to a place of success and stability. I think they naturally assume that that is all credited to hard work and education and good moral values and all of that stuff. And unfortunately, I don't think they see that in the African American population. But as we know, in our generations, that is not just an Asian American value, right? That is something that is shared amongst all races, including African Americans. And I think something that we need to remember to mention in all of these conversations is they are starting at a disadvantaged position. And that even with all the similar values and morals and work ethic, there are several barriers and hindrances in place in our system that are preventing them from achieving that kind of a success in the straightforward way that maybe our parents were able to do.
I think it's also worth mentioning that it is only because of the civil rights movement led by MLK that our parents were even able to immigrate here. The whole civil rights movement led to the Immigration Act of 1965, which removed the quota, kind of paved the way for our parents to even immigrate here and then start a life here.
I mean, I think I totally agree that we don't want to diminish or discredit what our parents accomplished. I think we should be, if anything, extremely proud of what they did. Coming here from a foreign country, building a life for themselves, starting a family, and raising us the way they did. So I don't want to take any of that away from them. At the same time, I do think that our parents sometimes have a somewhat a narrow view of American history. Which is understandable given that they didn't grow up here, but I think sometimes they miss the full context and picture of racism in this country, stretching back from even before this country was founded, with the history of slavery and even the Reconstruction era and Jim Crow laws, and the Civil Rights movement wasn't until the 60s. That's recent history, and since then things like redlining and just a lot of systemic issues that I think just show that, as Michelle said, the playing field isn't really equal in the same way. I think there are specific laws and systems that target Black Americans that don't affect us in the same way. I think for me, one pretty clear example is just the way the laws applied with respect to drug use. A vast majority, I think 95% of arrests in the U.S. are for non-violent offenses.
Right. A
large percent of that is for drug use and drug possession. And to me, it's just so striking that, I think it's fair to say that drug use itself doesn't actually vary that much by race. But in terms of the people who actually get in trouble for it and end up going to jail, right, disproportionately Black and brown too. I know plenty of friends who have used or have possessed drugs, and they all did so without fear that they would be arrested and sent to jail. Whereas a Black person who has even an ounce of marijuana can get sent to jail for that. And a huge amount of incarcerated people in America are for drug-related offenses. And that's just one way in which I think even if the law itself isn't explicitly discriminatory or racist per se, the way that's applied through policing, through law enforcement is. And I think that nuance is something that's often lost on our parents.
For sure.
I also think that, to bring up MLK, there's a great quote of his where he said, "Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere."
Mm-hmm.
I think we're all Americans. I think we're all in this together. I think we should be hurt and affected by senseless police violence against Black Americans and racism that still exists. To me, it's like, even if it doesn't directly affect us, which it does in its own way, I think we should still stand in solidarity.
I mean, I agree, the racism that African Americans face, that itself doesn't affect us in a similar way, but I would say that African American culture and a lot of the accomplishments that they've achieved and a lot of the milestones that they've led this country into is very much directly affecting everyone's life, not just Asian Americans.
So I think to end the video, I really wanted to just ask each and every one of you, what's next? What will we do, or what have we been doing to help this movement?
So one thing that I have done, I've looked up a bunch of different organizations that combat systemic racism and police brutality and stuff. And the two organizations that boils down to me are the NAACP and EGI. They both fight against systemic racism in their own ways.
I am also trying to support more Black-owned businesses. I recently purchased a couple of books from some Black-owned bookstores, and in efforts of just trying to educate myself a little bit more on our history and why a lot of the past actions have led to where we are now in current day America. But I'm also trying to educate myself in other ways, like podcasts and documentaries and all of that stuff. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, echo what both of you said. I think for me, I've been trying to financially support organizations I feel are doing good with things like criminal justice reform, voting rights, and other types of racism in the country. Mm-hmm. Definitely trying to educate myself. I'm always learning more. I want to address my own biases, I think, so trying to read more literature and watch documentaries and listen to podcasts and all of that. Trying to also speak up. Part of it's also just having conversations that I otherwise may have shied away from. With my parents, for example, or with friends who don't always see eye to eye. I think it's important to engage, and sometimes I wonder how much good does it do to repost things on Instagram or share something on social media. But I think even just taking a stand also signals to other people who may not have known what your views are that you are standing in solidarity with them and that you're there to support them. You can start a dialogue, and I think ultimately at the end of the day, for so many of us, the people we can influence are people in our circles, and it's important to try to have those dialogues and do what we can to change hearts and minds.
So I think just having dialogue with you guys have definitely changed my perspective on the entire situation, and it's made me personally want to get more educated on the entire situation and to, just like you said, maybe get some more books or get to know our history a little better. But I think at the end of the day, even if you aren't able to maybe monetarily support the businesses or the organizations you've been talking about, just educating yourself and also just spreading awareness sometimes helps more than giving them money.
Mm-hmm.
One more thing that I forgot, trying to play a more active role in the political process too.
Okay.
So actually, calling or emailing or your congressperson and voting too. Local elections matter just as much as state and national ones too.
Yeah, again, this really isn't the normality of the video for us, but again, this is something just so important that I think we should definitely talk about and continue to talk about. And hopefully today, after you watch this video, you can be inspired to go out and to make more conversation about this, and talk to your friends, talk to your family. Anyways, thank you again for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.